Another Jeeping with Cool Guy video. What else have you got to do with your time? Good evening, folks, and welcome to another episode of Jeeping with Cool Guy. Before we get into all the details that are about to come, I want to preface this whole video with this intro that I'm about to explain to you is very long. So if you want to skip ahead and not hear about why I'm doing this, then no problem. But there are some key points in there, so you might want to watch the whole thing. This was a episode that I really hadn't planned on filming, but I ran into some complications and I want to tell you about what I did wrong, and the result thereof. When we had bought this 84 a few years back, I completely restored the whole thing, except for the internal parts of the engine. It was burning oil at that point. I kind of knew about it, and it was one of those things that I decided to delay for a little while. It just got to the point where it was going through a quart of oil every 100 miles, blowing blue smoke out the back, and it bothered me. I mean, obviously having an old CJ7, I can only claim as being an environmentalist as you can be with that in your portfolio, but I wasn't a big fan of blowing blue smoke out all over the place. Wanted this thing to run really well, and it really wasn't. So I decided to rebuild the engine. Rebuilding an engine on an old vehicle is a very daunting task. It is something that I hadn't done before, and it was like really intimidating. But like everything else, I decided, all right, let's just see what happens. So I took the engine apart as much as I could inside of the engine bay, meaning I took the valve cover off, I took the head off, and then I took all the components off of it, all the manifolds. I disconnected everything that I possibly could off of that engine block to reduce the amount of weight that I would have to have an engine hoist pick up and out of the engine bay. Now, the reason I did that was because I only had access to a Harbor Freight engine hoist. It actually served purpose really well, but the problem with the Harbor Freight engine hoist is that even if you put it on a quarter of a ton, the arm doesn't really extend out as far as you need it to be able to put the hoist in the front of the Jeep underneath the grill and be able to get it down to where you can lift it up at any particular angle to bring the engine block out straight. And I didn't want to have to remove the grill, mess up the paint if that were the case, or take off any one of the fenders. So what I did was I measured between the two fenders and found that the engine was actually 2 inches closer to this side of the vehicle, to the passenger side vehicle, than it was to that. So I took off the passenger side wheel, brought the hoist in right here, and I was able to get enough of an arm length of the hoist to where I could bring the engine up and then pull it back out and take the engine out over the top of this fender without having to take any of the body components off. I feel that that was a major win. So the next chapter in this saga was getting the engine actually rebuilt. So I took everything apart on the engine, both on the head and on the engine block itself. I put it up on an engine jack, put the cylinder head in the basement, and I took everything off of both components to where it was just stripped down. And I took it to a machine shop, and I paid about $2,200 to have it done. Now what I had done in that was I had the cylinders bored 0.3 over, or 0.03 over. I had the block resurfaced. I had it dipped in an acid tank, so it cleaned everything off of the engine block, and all that you were left with was pristine, clean, pure metal. And then I also had the cylinder head resurfaced, and I put in new valves, new springs, new lifters, new rods, new piston rods, new piston heads, new piston rings, and I also had the crankshaft turned. So I had $700 of that was just in parts. The only thing that was original from the internal parts of the engine was the crankshaft and the piston rods. I kept the piston rods. They had AMC stamped on. It's kind of cool. I'll show you those later on. Anyways, so for $2,200 I had all of that done, and the nice thing about that is that the machine shop actually put the cylinder head back together. So they put the valves in, the springs, the valve seals, and everything for me. That was really cool. It could have been more, but I decided that I wanted to put the engine back in myself, and I also wanted to put everything back together myself. So to make a very long introductory story shorter, I put everything back together down to the minutia of every spec number, and I forgot to put on the camshaft sprocket bolt. Why? I had no idea. Absolute idiot move. Everything else was perfect, but I didn't put that bolt in. So I go to start it up. On initial startup, bang! Sprocket pops off of the camshaft, goes right through the timing chain cover, breaks a hole in the top of it that big. Completely and utterly devastated. I mean, I thought that I had done this by the book to the T, everything was on, and I forgot one of the most important pieces of the timing chain, connected to the crankshaft, connected to the camshaft. Moron. Alright, so what happened is that in the process of that bolt not being applied and the sprocket breaking out of the valve cover, the engine still fired a couple times because I turned it, it went bam, bam, and what was happening is that the crankshaft was turning, but the camshaft wasn't. So it was firing at the wrong times, and I wound up blowing out the head gasket and not realizing it. So I get a new timing cover, put that back in, I get everything back on, think I'm ready to go. Start it up, it's running really freaking rough, and I've got moisture coming out of the PCV valve on the top of the valve cover, and engine's heating up really fast. I opened up the radiator and I noticed that the radiator fluid was actually going down, so that was really, really unsettling. So I only ran that for about 2 minutes before I figured out what the problem was. So once I shut it all down, and then in complete panic mode, drained the oil after I let the engine cool down a little, and the motor oil came out looking like a Frappuccino. Unfortunately, I didn't film the oil when it was the right color, but take this, and this is brand new oil. It looks like it's been run for 50,000 miles, but it was a super light brown, because what had happened is that all the oil had mixed up with a bunch of antifreeze, and it turned this light tan brown. So here I am, thinking that I completely destroyed the engine. Like I just wasted $2,200, cracked the engine block, cracked the cylinder head. It was a rather rough evening. So slept on it. In the morning, decided that one way or the other, I have to tear the whole thing back down again. So I started taking everything down. And I also consulted an individual who I think is probably the best in the business. His name's Ray Moulton. Incredible, incredible guy. I mean, this guy his Jeep knowledge is wicked good. He's like, yeah, I bet you blew your head gasket out. Sure enough, there was a strip of the paper that had gone from the first cylinder into one of the radiator fluid flow points in the engine block. Alright, well at least I had my answer. Didn't make me feel better, but I had my answer. And everything considered, that's a pretty minimal problem. So with all of that said, I want to explain that to you, in that if you do decide to take on an engine rebuild, make sure that you don't have anything left over. Double, triple check everything that you install just to make sure that you do it right. Rebuilding an engine is not very hard to do. It really isn't. And I found that it was surprisingly easy to do. I let the machine shop do their work, and they did it really well. They did it with a high level of professionalism and quality. And then all that I had to do was just put it back into place. Now, obviously I missed something rather important, screwed it up, but that's what we're going to go through tonight, and we'll talk about all the things that go with that. Once you get the cylinder head off and you've taken off the blown head gasket, or you're just replacing your head gasket, and after you've cleaned up the surface, so there might be some residue on here. I just took a very, very super light sanding pad. I think it was at 500, just like a buffing pad almost, and just scraped off any residue of the head gasket that was left. Then, once you do that, you want to take a rag and you want to clean out all the residue that is from the oil, dirt, whatever that may be. Clean off your piston heads. Get rid of any gasket material that has fallen down into the cylinders. And then you want to use a good amount of engine assembly lube to grease up the cylinders themselves. The best way that I've found is to rotate the crankshaft by way of the harmonic balancer bolt, mounting bolt, and then rotate it to where the cylinder, each one of the cylinders is all the way at the bottom. Put your assembly lube on the inside of the cylinder, spread it out with a rag, and then rotate the crankshaft so that you get all that lube distributed throughout the cylinder. Before we move any further, I wanted to point something out real quick. Right here is where the head gasket originally had, it didn't crack, it had just, the compression had blown out the paper part of the head gasket. And you can see how the radiator fluid went all along that engine block right on the top part of the cylinder head. So it just went all the way, and then it got into every one of the oil ports and got down into the lifters and just got itself all churned up. The point that I'm trying to make to all this is to make sure that you've got a nice clean surface, very level surface for your cylinder head gasket to rest upon and to seal up. The other thing I've also done is, while I've got it here, I've got the number one cylinder set to top dead center on the compression cycle. That way I don't have to go back and reset the timing and try and figure it all out. Distributor installed at the right point. Everything's already set as I'm closing this up. Let's move on to installing the cylinder head gasket. I'm not advertising any particular brand. This is the engine rebuild gasket set that my machine shop purchased for me as part of their rebuild system. As far as he was concerned, the Fel Pro happens to be the best one for this particular application. Some head gaskets will come with a label on it saying top or valve cover or block or some kind of indicator as to which way it goes. This, strangely enough, doesn't seem to have one. And the difficulty about that is this thing looked absolutely identical from side to side. Not 100% sure what the true difference is, except for one small detail. The back of the engine block has these two ports for the radiator fluid flow. And it has this one hole at the top, or the front of the engine block. On the head gasket, it has these two ports for these back coolant channels, and it has two holes up here for the bolt and the coolant. So that's the only way that I could tell the difference between the front and the back. You do not need to use any sealant, you don't need to use any RTV, you don't need to use anything on this. This has a micro thin paper cover, and it's a metal cord cylinder head gasket. So there's a lot of things that I'm not going to cover in this video. One, because I've already done them. Two, is because I don't really know what the best way to do this actually is under these circumstances. The one thing I do know is that I need to get out as much of this radiator fluid as I can from the channels in the engine block. So in the process of cleaning up this surface, I've got a turkey baster and I sucked everything out of the lifters and the lift push rods channels down here as much as I could, and pushed that down into the drainage channels at the bottom of the lifter compartments. And then I took diesel engine oil, and I will get to that later as to why I did that. And I pumped a whole bunch of oil down into these areas so that it will dilute, if not remove and push all of the radiator fluid that is remnant in here down into the oil pan. After I've done that, I've gone over this entire surface with a very clean lint-free towel, rag, and brake cleaner. That's a great way to get oils and everything off of a metal surface. So now that we've got that all cleaned up and we've got as much oil in here, and it also helps to kind of prime these areas, so if you can fill these up with oil, that also helps your lifters and your push rods to break in. So here's the head before we put it on. I've still got the exhaust manifold gasket already on here. You can see how everything's already been installed. One thing I did do is I took some brake cleaner and a putty knife and scraped all of the gasket material off of the mating surface for the valve cover. And then went over that with a whole bunch of brake clean to make sure that there is absolutely nothing on here, there's no oil. At this point, details are what matter. And you want to make sure that you take the time to clean the surfaces to where there's nothing left. You've got it all prepped and ready to go. So let's go install the cylinder head. One thing to note before we put the cylinder head back on, when you put your cylinder head gasket on, make sure that you get all of the holes aligned up as best as you possibly can. What you could do is you could take a bolt that has the same thread count as the cylinder head bolts, cut the head off of it, and insert one in the front and one in the back, and you could use those as guide pins. I'm not really worried about it all that much, but realize that your cylinder head, God, the thing weighs 80 pounds maybe. It's not light, and it's kind of an awkward pickup. So anything that you can do to help with your alignment of the cylinder head onto your engine block, it's probably going to behoove you. The other thing I'd recommend doing is taking this in stages, meaning that put a towel or some kind of a buffer on top of your grill, and then lift your cylinder head up, put it on here so that you can just easily pick it up and then put it right onto your engine block. Just like this. Huh. It seems that the parking brake is not set. Might need to go do that real quick. Okay, now just climb up into your engine bay. Find a nice place for your feet, if there is such a place. There is no recommended way that I'm going to tell you how to do this. I'm just going to say be very careful. Lift with your legs if you can. Well, that was not graceful. I have to realign this. Alright, let me go through and do that real quick. Alright, so now that I've got that all aligned, it's not an exact science. You can shift it around a little bit. You just want to make sure that your holes are aligned with the gaskets. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of these type of bolts. They're all the exact same length. I believe they are 5/16, but these are your original head bolts. You can get a new set if you want. I'm just reusing what I had before, just because the threads are still really good on them, and I don't think that this has ever been taken apart except for this one particular time. So want to finger tight these things down in. Now we're going to do the driver's side, and these are different bolts in that not only their configuration but their length. The first bolt, which is up by the water pump, looks like a double threaded bolt with a hex nut on it. This is fused on or built into the actual bolt, so this nut does not actually come off. The other type of bolt is exactly like the 8 that we put in on the passenger side, only it's about, I want to say 3/4 of an inch longer. The order that these are placed in is this one with the nut installed in the very front hole, and then the next 3, this one, this one, and this one, are this type of bolt. And then the last 3 are exactly like the first bolt. So just like the passenger side, you want to finger tighten these things down into the block. One thing I forgot, this front bolt, one up by the water pump, this one is the only one that you install with thread locker, and you want to use high temp thread locker. You don't need a lot of this stuff, you just need a little bit for the first few threads. This is Permatex thread sealant, high temperature. Right, now that we've got all these bolts in here finger tight, you want to tighten all of the bolts down to 85 foot-pounds, sans 1. This one. This is actually called the number 11 bolt because that's the number that falls in the sequence of the tightening pattern. This one that you put the thread locker on is only supposed to be tightened down to 75 foot-pounds. 85 for everything else, 75 for this. The tightening pattern for this is you want to start from the inside and go in a clockwise rotation all the way out. So you're going to want to start with the number 4 bolt back from the front of the engine on the passenger side. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, again 75 foot-pounds, 12, 13, and 14 back by the temperature sensor. So again, starting with the 4th bolt back on the passenger side. Alright, got around to the 11th bolt here. Change it to 75. Now back up to 85. Last but not least, 85 foot-pounds. So now that we got this all installed, this is all cleaned up, I'm gonna do a little bit of a drip line of some diesel oil on each one of these springs and the valves, and then leave it to soak down over tonight so that it gets down into all of these things. When I reassembled all of this, I made sure that there was plenty of assembly lube on every one of these metal contact points. But that was a few weeks ago, and I've already gone through, taken the head off, and so on. What I want to do is make sure that I've still got some good lubrication in here, and this just gives me an opportunity to do some pre-ignition, pre-break-in lubrication before we put the valve cover on. Actually, the next thing that we need to do is to put the rocker arms and the push rods back in. We'll do that next. But I want to take this brief moment to talk to you about engine oil. The older flat tappet type of lifters in these older AMC engines need a lot of zinc, and over the past 3 or 4 decades, the oil companies have been reducing the amount of zinc that's actually in the motor oils. And the zinc helps kind of seal up and provide a lubrication to these inner working parts on these metals. What happens is that the zinc winds up burning up, and as they put more catalytic converters on there, the zinc winds up clogging up the catalytic converters a little bit more than back then. So when they went from pretty much no catalytic converters to catalytic converters, there was so much zinc in the oils that it was clogging them up. So the oil companies started using less zinc. That's tough for these older engines, especially on a rebuild. What you want to do is make sure that you have high zinc in your oil. So there's this great debate on CJs around what type of oil you're supposed to use in there. First off, you should never use synthetic. So what was recommended by the camshaft manufacturer was one of 3 types of oils, and all 3 of them are diesel engine oils. And one of them was this Shell Rotella T4. It's a 10W30. The other thing you'll want to do is to get this Zinc Plus. Lucas Oil makes it. It's for hot rod classic cars and race engines. It's basically a high content zinc. So what you're going to do is you're going to put this type of oil in your engine on your break-in, and that will help cure the metals on the inside of the engine. You want to make sure that whatever engine oil you use for this on your break-in, and potentially as you drive your CJ from now into the future, you use a diesel engine oil that has a higher level of zinc content in it. Okay, so let's put the push rods and the rockers back in. I know that I didn't need to do this with a completely brand new set of push rods and rocker arms and everything, but since I did run it a little bit, I at least wanted to put them back into the exact same place that I had put them in initially. So the way that I've gotten this broken down is this is the number 1 cylinder rocker arm. This is the left and the right, meaning the left faces the front of the engine and the right faces the rear of the engine, so that I know which push rod goes with which lifter. So let's drop these in. One thing I would recommend doing is putting a little bit of assembly lube on the end of your push rods and on the underside of your rocker arm. When you install these back in, if you're using the original ones that were in there before, you want to make sure that this oil hole is clear all the way through. You should be able to see through this with no obstructions. That push rod uses the up and down motion to pump oil through the rocker arm into this little port that's in the rocker arm. So it fits in there just like that. And that's just another way that the engine cycles oil through it. Start with your push rods, insert them into each one of these channels. And I would also recommend getting a flashlight and shining down into the rocker arm channel to verify that the push rod is sitting right in the center part of the lifter. And then you want to take your rocker arm assembly, which consists of your 2 rocker arms, the bridge, the pivot, and the bolts for each one. Very lightly put this over the top with the push rod fitting up into that hole indentation on the rocker arm, and the back part of the rocker arm resting right on top of the valve end. And then you want to make sure that you align these screws with their respective holes. Once you get these bolts finger tight, tighten them down with your torque wrench 1 full turn at a time, and then you alternate until you get to 19 foot-pounds. If you tighten down one all the way without tightening down the other at the same increments, then you risk bending this rocker arm bridge, and that winds up affecting how the pivot arm and the bridge and the rocker arm itself, and ultimately the push rods, how fast they will wear. One thing I do want to point out about the rocker arm bridges, even the quality ones, if you want to call it that, I have found that every third one is bent. And I'm not saying bent like this, I'm bent like the tabs are kind of facing forward. It's almost like they're duck-footed a little bit. So what you want to do is you want to put it into a vise, make sure that it's flat and level and square, because you want to make sure that there is as very little wear and tear on this as possible. Right, now that we got all the rocker arms in place and I've got these all finger tight, one thing I did want to note is that when you have the crankshaft in whatever position it is, I have mine set at top dead center on cylinder 1, that when you're tightening these down, you're going to have the exhaust and the intake valves open or closed on various cylinders. So as you're tightening this down, you're going to find that for instance, for me, I think it's the intake valve is open, exhaust is closed. So there's going to be a variance between how long these springs are extended. So that's why you want to be very careful when you're tightening this thing down, to do it one rotation at a time. Now that we've got them all in, let's crank these down to 19 foot-pounds. I didn't have to crank them down very tight. 19 foot-pounds is not very intense. And I didn't have to go a full rotation once I got them down and seated. One thing I did want to note is this is for an 84. So I'm pretty sure that in 84 they switched over to the plastic valve covers. May have been in 82. Not 100% sure on that one. But the plastic valve covers are notorious for leaking. And we will get to that in a few moments as to the variations in the valve covers. But for this instance, I did want to bring up that for the plastic valve covers, these bridges are different. I think it's the second one and the fifth one, rocker bridges, have a post that go up, and the plastic valve cover fits down over that, and then that is bolted down onto the top of this rocker arm. So one, I would recommend getting rid of that plastic valve cover, and I know that this is a non-OEM thing, I get that, but the concern is that these plastic valve covers, they went plastic because it was the cheapest that they could do. There was no need for durability or longevity on those. So if you go with an aluminum valve cover, aftermarket valve cover, you will be replacing this rocker arm bridge and this rocker arm bridge, because you won't be able to fit the new valve cover over the top of it because that bolt's going to be sticking up. So now we're going to install the valve cover and the gasket that goes with it. I'm going to recommend two things. One, go with a nice thick cork gasket. The reason that I recommend the cork is because it's got a lot more give, and if you use the right gasket sealant, then this will be perfect for your needs for as long as you have it. And while we're talking about it, I want to show you the aluminum valve cover. There's various versions of this one in particular. One of them has Jeep on it, another one has OMX ADA. I just went with the 4.2 liter because it's the most agnostic that you can get, but the structure is pretty much all the exact same. Now, the difference between the aluminum and the metal one, and I'll show you the metal one on the 79 here in a few minutes, is that, and this is also why I recommend the cork, is because aluminum is not flexible. It will only crack. You're only supposed to install the fastening bolts for these at some really low level. We'll look it up here in a few minutes. I think it's like 13 foot-pounds. It's really, really super light. So you want something that has a nice amount of give to it. That's why the cork valve cover gasket works really well for this instance. And on the steel ones, people have a habit of trying to stem off the leaks by over tightening them. And then as a result, they actually wind up bending the thread holes on the valve cover, and then they just put on more sealant and more sealant and more sealant. It doesn't really work. So we'll also talk about that in a moment. The other thing that I'm going to recommend is this Permatex Gasket Schlack compound, Schlack. It's originally known as Indian head Schlack, gasket Schlack. This stuff is really, really awesome. And it works really well with paper and cork. It's not going to work very well with rubber, because with the rubber ones, the Felpro rubber ones or the Mahale ones, rubber ones, that's where RTV comes into play, because they're both silicone based, rubberized base, where this is more of like an actual glue type sealant, and it works really well with the cork. So I would not recommend using RTV with the cork, because it's silicone and it doesn't get into the crevices, or it doesn't adhere as well to the cork or the paper as well as this Schlack will. Now, this stuff is a mess, so I recommend putting on gloves when installing it. So the lighting may not be all that great in here, and I also have the air cleaner on. But this is what the steel valve cover looks like. This was, I'm sure it was pre-76, but it was at least 76 to 82 or 84. I'm going to go with 84, because I think that's when they actually went over to the plastic valve covers, and they were really trying to cut costs. This is not very thick steel, maybe 18 gauge, but people have a habit of trying to over tighten these bolts to pull down the valve cover to stem off leaks, when what they really need to do is take the valve cover off and replace the gasket. And here again, I've got a nice thick cork gasket on here with the Schlack on it, and I've been running this for a good 2,000 miles, and this thing is sealed up. So grab your gasket, grab your Schlack, grab some rubber gloves. Be aware that this stuff is really messy. It comes out with this kind of a foam hairy brush. What you want to do is coat both sides of the gasket with a pretty light film. You don't want any heavy deposits of this stuff. Just kind of want to brush it on to where it's a nice even level. Go around the holes. Probably take you 5 minutes, give or take, to do. But you want to make sure that you get both sides. And then once you're done with that, you want to wait a few minutes for this thing to become tacky. Even tackier than it already is. Once that sets up, then you can put it on your cylinder head. Alright, now that I've got it coated pretty well, I went back over it. You just kind of paint it on for the most part. Inspect it just to make sure you don't have spots where there's a whole bunch of buildup. But by the time you get both sides done, this stuff pretty much already starts to set up. I'm in about 80-degree weather right now, so it only takes a few minutes for it to really start getting truly tacky. When you're putting this thing on, you want to make sure that you don't get any of this stuff on the rocker arms. Seems to be challenging. Lay it down nice and easy, lining up your bolt holes as you go along. The driver's side part of the gasket is probably the most difficult part, just because it's a fairly thick gasket and it needs to fit around cylinder head bolts, and those have a tendency to butt right up against it. So once you got that in, got it fairly aligned, now you want to install your valve cover. Run some brake clean over the edge of your valve cover just to make sure everything's cleaned off of that. There's no oils or anything like that. And then install valve cover with the bolt channels facing the driver's side of the vehicle. Now, there's a bolt back here on the very back part of the firewall, which is the back part of your heater box. So you want to make sure that you get the lip of the valve cover around that first, and then you can lay it down over the top of the cylinder head a lot easier. Move it around a little bit, make sure you got some nice adhesion, kind of spreading out the gasket sealant. And another thing that helps out is to have a screwdriver that you can use as a pilot to maneuver the gasket as you put the bolts in there, so you can get the gasket, the valve cover hole, and the cylinder block threaded hole all aligned easily. So what I've done is, and I can't even recall what these bolts used to look like, but the clearance around the bolt heads, if you were to just use a typical hex head bolt, is so minimal with this valve cover that you can't get a socket in there. So I've gone with these hex head Allen wrench head bolts, and as you go around the valve cover head, they're different sizes. The ones that are on the side of the valve cover are 1/4, and they are 3/4 of an inch deep. Ones at the front and the back by the water pump and the firewall are 3/16 inch Allen wrench bolts and 3/4 of an inch long. One back by the firewall is a real pain in the ass to get in. You do not need any thread locker for any of these things, and all of them need to be installed at 28 inch-pounds, not foot-pounds, inch-pounds. Now I'm going to put the one in the back here. This one's a major pain in the butt because it fits right behind, or right in between the valve cover and the firewall. And there's this small channel that you can put the bolt down into. Getting it to fall into that hole is a lucky charm to begin with. And hey, I did it. So I'm going to do this one with an Allen wrench. I'm going to hook the other ones in and get a feel for that. And then I'm just going to do this one by hand. Okay, now that I've got that in there, I would recommend installing these bolts in the same torque pattern as you did the cylinder head. So I'd start with the driver's side middle, or the passenger side middle, and I would go here, 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 front, back. These inch-pounds are so incredibly light. To give you an idea, basically it's 12 inch-pounds for every foot-pound. Yeah, kind of makes sense. So unless you have a foot-pound torque wrench that is incredibly accurate, you're basically installing these things at 2.8 foot-pounds. Well, no, actually it'd be more like, yeah, 2.8 foot-pounds, give or take. I recommend getting an inch-pound torque wrench. But these things are so light as far as the click when they get to the right torque. So just be careful on that. Well, boys and girls, there's another episode of Jeep with Cool Guy. Again, not a video that I really wanted to do under these circumstances. Hopefully this doesn't happen to you. But the thing that you can take away from this is how to reinstall or how to replace your cylinder head gasket if you have a blown cylinder head gasket, and then also how to, or what to use when you're replacing your valve cover gasket. Both of those two things are good takeaways from this video. And once again, the most important thing that I want you to take away from all of this is to like and subscribe. It just makes me feel better about myself.